This week's chat is with Tim Thompson. You'll hear my introduction for him in just a second, but I just want to say that this week I was really sick when I did the interview. I've tried to edit out most of the snorts, honks, and coughs, but you're still going to hear a little bit of that. I want to thank Tim for putting up with it. I think it was pretty distracting during the interview, but nevertheless, we covered a lot of interesting information. I hope you enjoy. See you at the backside. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of having a chat with Tim Thompson. I've kind of known of Tim for quite some time. He produced a product called KeyKit, which was a fun experimental way to work on sequencing functions. And he's been kind of in and out of my peripheral vision for some number of years. Well, last year he popped up again. He stopped at my friend Mark's house and set up something called a space pallet, which I'd not heard of, but when I saw it, and especially when I got a chance to play with it, I was kind of floored. So I was really looking forward to the chance to talk to Tim. Tim was kind enough to be willing to talk. So with that, I introduce you to Tim Thompson. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Hi, how are you? Good.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk with us. I think this is going to be really interesting for people.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we kick off by having you explain a little bit about what you're currently working on?
Well, what I'm currently working on is a MIDI visualizer, and I'm using the Linnstrument, Roger Linn's new controller as the controller for it. And so it's called the Unilooper, and it's a 4-track MIDI looper with an integrated visualization system to visualize the MIDI notes as they're happening, whether they're coming from the looper or from real-time playing. So that's the current new thing I'm working on.
Sure. Now, the thing that I saw you working on was the space palette, which was quite, I guess it's like a MIDI controller, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, ultimately, it's one way to think of it is it's mouse pads in midair,
right?
And the frame that's in front of you separates the different areas, so you get multiple three-dimensional mouse pads in midair.
Right. One of the things that kind of blew me away was watching kids interact with this thing. First of all, when people think of the idea of MIDI controllers, they generally think of like a box of knobs or something. And instead, someone should think of this almost as being like a picture window with some open slots or something that you can put your hands through and kind of manipulate that world, hence the mouse pad idea. I saw kids playing with this thing. They had a blast. There was something about it that was extremely approachable and really engage kids in a way that you don't normally see them engage in hardware before. How much of that was something you had kind of intuited, and how much of it was just the luck of the draw?
Well, there's a number of things that feed into that. I've been doing interactive installations for other people to play with at Burning Man and other festivals for over a decade. So that kind of informs how I build things and make things easy for people to play with and get interesting results. And then I've just been into three-dimensional input interfaces. I think the fact that you don't touch anything is certainly key to the approachability of it. A lot of people may feel, timid about touching things, but if you don't have to touch anything, maybe that opens them up. I think there's a lot of aspects of dancing with your hands. Motion is kind of inherent in people when they're enjoying music. The dancing is the obvious thing that people do voluntarily, and the space palette kind of lets you dance with your hands. So that's a large part of it, and the amount of space that the space palette provides, it's a fairly large thing, so you're not restricted. So it's a very freeing kind of expressivity that's kind of midway between a traditional instrument that you touch and dancing, somewhat strangely, but it's very much like dancing with your hands. Tai Chi-like motion with your hands is actually one of the best ways of playing the space palette.
Oh, sure. That's interesting. Well, it's also cool that this kind of came out of personal research in displaying these things at places like Burning Man, because and maybe it ties into the fact that I saw children really enjoy it. It seems like something happens that as we become adults and as we get older, we start getting to be too self-conscious to dance. But children don't have that kind of restriction, nor do people at a festival like Burning Man. So maybe there's a interesting connection there of some sort.
It's definitely true that the people at festivals like Burning Man are inherently creative, or more explicitly intentionally creative. One of the purposes of the Space Palette is to let people who don't consider themselves musicians, who have never played a musical instrument in their lives, to play a musical instrument that requires no practice or training. The term I use is a casual instrument, very analogous to a casual game that, like Angry Birds, that has very few mechanical things you need to understand before you can then use it quite freely. So that's been one of the primary aspects, is and especially in the current Space Palette user interface, is oriented toward being a casual instrument as opposed to a performance instrument, which it could be with a completely different user interface.
Right.
But I've definitely focused very carefully on the casual instrument use of it.
Sure. I'm going to want to come back to that concept because there's something interesting to dig into. But before I do that, I would like to know a little bit about your background. I'm always fascinated by people kind of telling me how they got to become the artists that they are. And already you've revealed some interesting information, but I'd like to know more. Can you tell us about how you got to where you are?
Sure. In high school, I grew up playing organ in the 60s, taking organ lessons. Somewhat strangely, I ended up playing organ in grocery stores as an advertisement for Con Organ. My parents became associated with them, and so as a kid, I could play the organ pretty well, and so I essentially became a demo person for Con Organ in grocery stores.
Wow.
But then in high school, I became interested in math. I started taking computer classes on weekends. Our high school didn't have anything, but started taking computer classes in Chicago at the Illinois Institute of Technology using punched cards. And so I became interested in math in general, perusing Scientific Americans in the library. I did Conway's Game of Life on punched cards and using fanfold paper as the output.
Wow.
But I was a musician, in parallel with that through high school. College, I started playing with a band or two, but mostly just improvising and developing my own compositional style and chops. And then I went through I got a master's in computer science at the University of Illinois, still just playing music on the side. Then in college, I built, actually this was quite noteworthy, the Southwest Technical Products Corporation had kits, electronic kits, and there was a kit, it was on the cover of Popular Electronics, and it was called Psych-Tone, and it was a box just cram-filled with buttons, and it had an algorithmic music bent to it. It was all discrete components, point-to-point wiring. So I built that kit, and had a lot of fun with that. It was very much along the lines of the Tridex Muse, which was an algorithmic thing using shift registers and so on. So,
Right.
so that was my first exposure to real hardware that did algorithmic composition, if you will. Around the same time, I also built a PAIA, P-A-I-A synthesizer, which was all I could afford, which is a very cheap monophonic synthesizer with very basic modules. So then, let's say through college, I did that kind of stuff. Occasionally did musical things on computer systems at the University of Illinois. But then I joined Bell Labs in New Jersey and started learning Unix and so on. Then MIDI came out in 83, 84.
Right.
And I knew that was the point at which the two worlds that I loved and was familiar with and good at, both music and computers, they suddenly collided, and I could do both at the same time, leveraging both. So at that point, I knew I was going to do a lot of musical programming. And so when MIDI came out, I decided to write a programming language that was specifically for MIDI. And at that point, it was called Keynote. And so I started very basic, very simple language, and then evolved it over the years and ported it to different machines. The Atari 520 ST was the first computer I got that had MIDI built in.
Right.
And then, IBM PC compatibles and so on. So I kept evolving Keynote. Every release added some new fundamental capability. At the same time, I was in Bell Labs. I started a mailing list called the Mostly MIDI Mailing List, MMML, because this was before social networking or anything. It was in the days of net news.
Right.
So that was quite one of my primary information sources. But for more personal contact, I started this mailing list of people interested in MIDI music stuff within Bell Labs, within AT&T. And so we would have, every year or so, everybody would send in some piece of music, and we collected them on cassettes. So that became a good vehicle in terms of providing a deadline. You had to produce something to put on that year's cassette. So deadlines have always been an important enabler for me. So there was a lot of experimentation around that time with MIDI. KeyKit kept growing. Originally, I built some of the behaviors into the language itself, but fairly early on, about version 3, I rewrote the language so that a lot of the algorithmic things I wanted to do could be expressed using the language rather than being embedded in the language.
Sure.
So that was a big change. And then I started adding graphical kind of things. In some ways, it was an experimentation vehicle for user interface things. This was around the time that multi-window systems, were being created. The Bell Labs had Rob Pike and Bart Locanthe created this thing called the BLIT, Bell Labs Intelligent Terminal, which is one of the first multi-window Unix interfaces. So that was very influential on what I was doing with Keynote. So I added multi-window stuff. I went through one aborted attempt at multi-window stuff, and then a second version worked well. So it was partially musical experimentation, but also user interface experimentation, because I wasn't at all satisfied with the Window systems at the time. But I still think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done with Window systems.
Sure. Some questions pop up. I mean, you talk about this being a vehicle for user interface experimentation, and my recollection is that there were a number of things that are now sort of common UI elements that you kind of played around with and experimented with and came up with early in the game. Certainly the on-screen virtualized keyboards and virtualized sequencers, I saw that in KeyKit before I saw it anywhere else. What are some other things that you were on the front end of?
The biggest one would be pull-off buttons. So at the time, the Next Step, which was the software company that Steve Jobs started after he left Apple the first time, they had pull-off menus. So I'm not sure how much I was influenced by that, but there were pull-off menus where any pop-up menu you have on the system, you can basically pull off and place on the screen permanently.
Right.
What I did with Keynote was do that, but also you could pull off individual buttons. That, it's actually one of the few things ideas I've had that I think I could have patented. I have patents through Bell Labs and the other and Network Appliance that I worked for. But the most noteworthy thing I think I came up with that I should have patented was pull-off buttons, although I purposely don't patent things I do when I want other people to use them.
Sure.
But in any case, so the pull-off buttons were key in the particular applications I was building. So within KeyKit, I had all sorts of graphical tools, little widgets, if you will, each one completely independent. But the biggest one was the sequencer, the multi-track sequencer, fairly standard, but it had lots of algorithmic editing operations. And
Right.
because the system was interpreted, I could actually add new editing operations on the fly, while the system was running. So if I was composing something and I needed something, I could just, write the code for it and use it right away without even stopping the compositional process. So as part of that, or because of that, the sequencer ended up with probably 100 different editing operations with deeply nested menus and so on. And the ability to pull off menu items individually, I could pull off an individual menu item, place it on the screen, pull off another one, place it on the screen. Each of those pulled off buttons was itself a window. And then I could rearrange these buttons into toolbars. And the key thing that made this a big win in this particular application was that at any point in the editing process, I'm using a particular set of operations. And then a few minutes later, I'm using some different set of operations. So the notion of creating toolbars that are fixed, that work all the time,
Right.
isn't as important as being able to create toolbars on the fly with whatever operations I'm currently, interested in, and being able to pull off individual buttons rather than pulling off an entire menu really made that a fairly unique environment. So that's a long way of describing the one thing I think that was particularly unique in that user interface.
That seems to strike at the heart of something that often comes up with software that's sort of artist focused, which is that so often, I mean, certainly for me working with Macs, I hear this a lot. People have this discussion, which is like, this would really work with me if only I had features X, Y, and Z. Well, if you take all the people that potentially might use the software and add each of their 3 favorite functions, you're going to end up with software with 1,500 functions.
Right.
And once it gets to that point, it becomes really unwieldy to use in any kind of interactive way. And so it seems like what you've done is you've done a way to basically almost be able to take your favorite features, tear them off, and build these dynamic toolbars that allow you to sort of functionally develop a system on the fly.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that was the key. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at marketing or promoting any of the things I come up with. So people discover it kind of accidentally. So that's the sad part of it.
Yeah. Well, what's the current status of KeyKit? Have you maintained it at all, or is it kind of did one of the operating system turns just kind of flummox you?
Well, no, since I use Windows, which values compatibility
Right.
more than most, and I stay with Windows because of that. Stuff I've wrote, 10 years ago still works fine, so I can spend my time on new things.
Right.
When I worked at AT&T, I Keynote wasn't part of my job or anything there, although I gave talks like at Usenix and so on about it. So when I left AT&T in '95, I made sure that it was licensed in a way that I could distribute it free for non-commercial use, so with complete source code. So that was the point at which it got renamed from Keynote to KeyKit, because the lawyer who blessed that arrangement said there was something else named Keynote. So that's when it became KeyKit and became publicly available for free. And because it's an interpreted language, it's very robust, and I've used it. I developed it for about 10 years, kind of just focusing on developing it. And then for the next 10 years, or till today, I focused on using it. So
Right.
at that point I stopped adding features, but it was already fairly robust. And then over the years, I've fixed any bugs that cropped up. So So I often hear from people who have been using it for a long time, and I never knew they were using it. So it hasn't needed a lot of support for people who are at least in the mindset of using a textual programming language,
Right.
In that kind of world.
Well, it's also interesting. You make a great point about Windows having a specific perspective that actually is really valuable for artists. I mean, it's really tiresome. I tend to use Mac OS a lot, and the problem with Mac OS is the number of times over the history of that operating system that my artistic palette has been forced to change because of arbitrary decisions that they've made. Mm-hmm. And so it's really it's a good point that Windows seems to be the least oriented towards having that happen because they put so much focus into backward compatibility.
Right. And I grew up with Unix, and I love Unix and command line stuff, and so if I was focused on, if my requirements revolved around a Unix-like system, that would attract me to OS X.
Right.
But these days I tend to use pretty much anything that's around, but try to focus on what my requirements are, and
rather than a religious
correct
fervor.
Right. I mean, I still, it's hard to avoid the religious thing when you found something that satisfies your requirements so well.
Right.
But it's always important to realize that your requirements are unique to yourself.
Right.
And decide for yourself and let other people decide for themselves, and we can all be happy.
Sure. So at some point, you turned from software development to hardware development. How did that happen?
The longer I played with KeyKit, toward the end, I started adding support for peripherals, joysticks, things you can plug into Windows. And one of the nice things about Windows, because it's so ubiquitous, is the support for large numbers of devices. And game controllers, in particular, are a rich resource of toys to turn into controllers. So I definitely started down that path. And when I came out to Silicon Valley, there were a number of opportunities locally here. There was a yearly concert in the Santa Cruz woods called Woodstockhausen, where a lot of the musical electronics people in the valley got together and showed each other what toys they were playing with, and it also had a very visual aspect to the performance. So there were visualists as well as musicians. So that became one of the first opportunities for me to actually perform with whatever weird thing I'd come up with that year. So one performance was entirely with a QWERTY keyboard in my lap. Next year or two, I started playing with the PlayStation dance pads, Dance Dance Revolution things. So I did one performance where I had 4 of those dance pads. Each one is a 4x4 or 3x3. Yeah, 3x3. So 4 of those laid out, and I did an entire performance dancing on those pads. At one time, I danced on the pads, but also had a wireless QWERTY keyboard hung around my neck. And the Woodstockhausen thing, one performance I did there dancing on those pads, to make it a little more interesting, I outlined my legs in EL wire, lit up my legs, and then they turned out all the lights. So all you could see on the stage were these ghostly legs dancing around, and that was generating all the music. So that was the beginning of playing with devices. And then I started going to Burning Man, which completely inverted my focus from being inwardly focused on creating things that I used to being outwardly focused in creating things that other people would use. So that was a big turning point. Around the same time I was using devices and controllers. So I started taking the dance pads to Burning Man. 2003, I created a big lyre called Dancing Under the Stars with Lyra. A couple dance pads in front, and then this 12-foot high lyre, like a harp, with 24 light ropes as strings, and then I had MIDI-controlled relays to turn the light ropes on and off.
Sure.
So as you're playing on these dance pads and generating, looping music, the strings of the harp were lighting up corresponding to the notes. So that was a big installation at Burning Man. the start of.
Burning Man was something that changed your vision on how to work, because it does seem like things like since that time you've been focused more on like social, almost like social instruments. I certainly would say that's the case with the Space Pallet. But the other thing I would say is that also seems to be the point at which the visualization became a really important part of the mix for you.
Right. About that time, 2004 or 5, GPUs and web cameras, visual hardware suddenly started to be affordable. And at the same time, I'd been doing algorithmic music stuff for decades. So at that point, I was kind of tired of doing just music. So
Sure.
so indeed that's the point at which, in fact, I started doing visuals only. There was a group centered in Oakland called DUD, D-U-D, led by Herb Hines. A fabulous collection of musicians who improvised complete songs out of the blue. Very accessible stuff, but completely improvised. Great musicians. And I joined as the only visualist. So I was experimenting with visual things, I created one system where they would improvise songs about whatever topic came to mind, and so I wanted to have visuals that corresponded to whatever they came up with.
Right.
So at the time they had these, this was the clip art world, so you could get CDs,
Yeah,
a stack
right.
of CDs with
Sure. Right.
hundreds of thousands of images, and fortunately I found one collection that had them tagged. So I created this system where at any point I could just type in a word, it would find images associated with that word, and then it was a Python-based system, and I could throw those images around on the screen and resize them and essentially use them as paintbrushes. So then I could visually respond to whatever they came up with conceptually with their songs. So that I did that, and then also started playing with camera-based stuff. And again, I guess it kind of always reflects my interest in doing things in real time, in the moment, where there's nothing pre-recorded. Perhaps the images are statically pre-recorded, but no visual or no sequences pre-recorded.
Right.
So I started playing with camera-based that could, the camera can capture whatever in front of it, whether it's a musician or a dancer, and then I can start manipulating that. So I started using a system called VVVV, which is an incredibly interesting visual system.
Right.
And I also started using Freeframe plugins, which is analogous to VST plugins, but for real-time visuals. So I started playing in the visual camera-based world, doing looping of dancers and so on. And then around that time, I guess I created this thing called LoopyCam, which is, again, an entirely visual instrument. It's a security camera. The first version was a security camera glued onto a joystick controller, and then a long cable to the computer. So with that, I could point the camera at anything, and with the joystick controller, I could control what the visual effects were in real time. So that became a visual instrument.
Okay.
That was successful enough. I created a second version of that had a number pad, be able to control more operations, and a little LCD display, just cobbled together. But as a visual real-time instrument, it's a lot of fun. So that was the initial visual world I got into. In parallel with that, I've always done like MIDI triggered visuals as well, doing like abstract graphics and so on, and I'd combine things I'd done musically with the visual stuff.
Right.
And basically I just continued that.
Yeah, I know when I saw Mark using your Space Pallet, he was using it to drive Resolume. Other than VVVV, do you have a tendency to use other developed software, or do you have a tendency to want to build your own thing?
Well, I'm a software developer, so and
That's the giveaway.
if you're a musician composer, you wouldn't use other people's compositions. You come up with your own. So I view, especially in the last decade or two, my software development is really an improvisational process. And a lot of musical compositions, you improvise and then you find things that work and you build compositions out of them. the same thing is true in software. You build little software things, and things that work out you develop further, and so on, in a very improvisational way. So I consider software to be composition, if you will, and hence I'll use things as frameworks. So I love VST plugins. I mean, that VST plugins completely transformed the musical world.
Right.
And the same thing, this is a rant I go off on, which is appropriate at this time. The same thing should be happening in the visual world. And there exists a standard called Freeframe, which is completely analogous to VST plugins. In fact, the API that you program to create a Freeframe plugin is almost identical to VST plugins, except that instead of passing in an array of floating point values as an audio thing, you pass in an OpenGL context.
Right.
So here's this framework that's sitting here, ideally suited to creating visual plugins and visual instruments, and nobody's using it for that. It's being used in minor ways. Resolume, in particular, has a fairly nice set of Freeframe plugins.
Right.
But nobody, or at least very few people, are using it to create new visual instruments. So that's been one of my priorities. And Space Pallet and Unilooper and pretty much everything I do now is makes use of the Freeframe standard. I even do musical things within a Freeframe plugin and send MIDI over to soft synths.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's been and it's amazing what visual results you can get with a very small set of plugins, just randomizing or controlling the parameters and combining them in different ways. The graphics that I generate as the core, which you might think of as like a sine wave, in Musically, you can take a sine wave or a square wave and pass it through all sorts of VST plugins and come up with incredibly interesting stuff. The same thing is true in the visual world. So I create very simple graphics, squares, circles, lines, and triangles, triggered from your hands, or triggered directly from your input, which is key, that you have that human connectivity to the core of what's happening. But then these Freeframe plugins can transform the visuals, these simple visuals, into incredibly interesting things. So that's really the secret to the Space Palette and some of the other things I've been doing lately.
And how you work, yeah. It sounds like what you're doing now is a different version of what you've always done. Your initial interests and fascination was around generative systems. But if you really think about it, the concept of taking simple source material and being selective about the kind of effects that you use is just a variation of a generative system. Mm-hmm. In that it's not completely knowable, but it's useful in a kind of a structured performance context.
And one key to that is, and I'm a big fan of randomization as a tool, and just algorithmic things in general, but I don't treat the output of the randomization or algorithm as the end point. It's a starting point, or the human mind can filter things incredibly quickly. So you can listen to something or look at something, and within under a second you decide, do I like it or I don't like it.
Right.
You can do that incredibly quickly, and if it takes you even a minute to come up with that variation, then you say, oh, I don't like that, and then it takes another minute and decide whether you like that or not. Your process becomes awkward or just unpleasant. Whereas if you create a system where you can randomize things and hear a new possibility, within a second, you can then decide in a second, and so your progress, the amount of space you can traverse and explore is so much greater. So I spend months or years developing to the point where I can then develop things super quickly, but it takes years to get to that point sometimes.
That's actually a really good point, and I see it in a lot of different things that are kind of currency right now, whether it's working with modular audio systems or working with visual systems or whatever. What you see a lot is that when it takes a fair amount of time to set something up, you have a tendency to want to say, well, I'm just going to live with the result.
Right.
And so it's almost the antithesis of an improvisational mode. You're improvisational in that you're kind of randomizing or using strange structures to create your material, but it's not improvisational in that you can't make immediate decisions and pivot quickly based on what you've seen or heard.
You can pivot pretty quickly, but
Well, I'm saying that in a lot of systems, so like I work a lot with a modular synthesizer, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you put together a patch and it turns out that it was bogus, it takes a while to rip it apart and put a new one together. So you'll have a tendency to say, well, it might be a little bogus, but I'm going to find a way to make it work, right?
Right. Like when the Nord Modular, its patching system, there was somebody who did a piece of software that you could essentially randomize or randomly generate a patch network.
Right.
And so that's the kind of thing that I like to do.
Yeah,
You can't
that's
do
pretty exciting stuff, yeah.
Yeah, you can't do that easily in the physical world, but in the virtual world, it's easy.
Right. Well, now that actually brings up another question that I'm curious about. You have a background as a software developer, and you're still, thankfully, you're willing to say, that's my method of composition. And so developing the software that I use is important to me. But there is a movement to basically move away from the computer and move away from software into more solely hardware solutions. That seems like that would almost run afoul to some of the way that you feel. What do you think about that kind of movement? And do you think it's a long-term thing, or is it short-lived?
Well, I'm happy to see people doing interesting things. It's for me, the flexibility of virtual things is much more attractive. I mean, I'm attracted to the physical things when they have an impact on the usability in terms of interacting with things. So I'm very much into controllers and building strange controllers and so on. But as far as using hardware for synthesis, whether it's audio synthesis or even video synthesis,
right?
It's too slow moving, I guess, or but I mean, it's a wonderful world, and you can definitely produce things that are hard to duplicate in the virtual world. But I'm just not into that world at the moment.
There are so many different ways to approach it. You're right. I mean, for me, there's something about the visceral nature of a modular synth that makes it useful, or makes it artistically useful for me to work with that. But from the standpoint of where you're coming from, and especially your interests, it seems like focusing hardware on the performative aspect really makes the most sense.
And making it more interesting for an audience. I mean,
right.
One of the things I think needs serious improvement is the stage environment that people perform in. I'm fairly uninterested in watching somebody standing over a collection of knobs and buttons. They can wave their hands and dance and try to get the crowd riled up, but as a performance visual, it's completely uninteresting. That's one reason why they have to have lots of projection mapped visuals, because the actual performer isn't all that interesting. Whereas in musical world, people are more, a guitarist playing on stage, can be more interesting. So I'm interested in performance controllers and environments that are more interesting. I mean, like the Earth Harp. There's a TV program, America's Got Talent, which actually is quite interesting in terms of the innovation in performance technologies or just ways of people doing entertaining things on stage. So that's one area. I think the Space Pallet in particular, even though I am completely focused at the moment on making it a casual instrument, I think it would be quite interesting as a stage instrument, as a performance controller, and you could develop a far more interesting visual performance using controllers like that. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for innovation in that direction.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Now, my next question then is, you mentioned that you're working with the Linnstrument, developing some visualization software. Have you worked with other instrument builders before?
Not that I can think of, no.
Okay. How is it working with someone else that kind of does that in a way at least similar to the way you do? I mean, Roger Linn's an amazing guy, and this Linnstrument looks like an amazing development. But I'm just curious, when you're used to making your own instruments, what's it like working with someone else that's an instrument builder?
Well, my involvement with Roger arose from a common interest in three-dimensional input. I gave a talk at what was one of the meetups. This is back in 2007 or something. There was a device called the Fingerworks Eye Gesture Pad, which is a multi-touch pad that could sense the area of your fingers. Incredible devices. Unfortunately, Apple bought them and took it off the market. So,
Right.
And they really haven't exposed the amount of performability that these eye gesture pads had, almost 10 years ago. But so I gave a talk on those, and Roger was very interested in the three-dimensional aspect of it, and so on. So he and I started interacting, and I helped him explore different technologies, different companies producing technologies that could be used in what he wanted to come up with as a controller. It eventually turned out that he had to roll his own because, like I said, Fingerwork got bought by Apple.
Right.
There was another company that got bought by Amazon. He kept trying these different companies, and they kept getting bought. And so he couldn't use their technology. So he finally invented his own. So along the way, I helped him with firmware, little pieces of code. And so when he finally got started with the latest Linnstrument, I helped a little bit with the firmware. Most of the firmware and incredible features of the Linnstrument are due to Geert Bevan, who's a fabulous software developer.
Right.
So, but Roger and I are also both interested in performing with notes as opposed to clips.
Right.
And so one of his crusades, which I share, is creating instruments that are meant for performing notes as opposed to clips, whether it's a pre-recorded song clip or a pre-recorded video clip. We're interested in notes as the core of what people play.
It's funny because I hadn't really thought about that being an issue until you mentioned it, and then I glance around my office at the variety of controllers that are like leaning up against the wall, and the number of them that are just grids of stuff meant to launch Ableton Live clips. And so it does seem like some of the note performance thing has kind of left the building.
Right, and Roger is very dedicated toward bringing it back into the building. One of the interesting aspects about the Linnstrument, I mean, all the keys are three-dimensional and incredibly expressive, but also one of the unique aspects of it compared to most grid controllers. Most grid controllers are square. The Linnstrument, being more of a performative thing, is wide. Roger's focus is more on making it very guitar-like, and
Right.
a lot of his features are devoted to that. I view it, in my usual orthogonal way, as just a grid of buttons that I can use. The fact that it's much wider horizontally makes it more keyboard-like, and I can control the colors. So in the Unilooper, which you can look on YouTube and find the video for the Unilooper
Okay.
using the Linnstrument, I turn the 8 rows of the Linnstrument into 4 2-row keyboards. And one of the things that I somewhat didn't realize, what I've been doing lately for the last decade, is creating instruments that can control multiple instruments simultaneously. So Space Pallet has 4 three-dimensional pads for 4 musical and visual instruments. When I saw the Linnstrument, I don't want to play just one instrument. I want to play, 4 instruments: drums, bass, and so on. It's very related to the looping, one-man
Right.
band kind of thing.
Yeah.
And actually over the weekend, I actually suddenly realized the importance of zero context switching between instruments. I want there to be no effort in changing instruments. So even just hitting a button to change the instrument is too much effort. I want all the instruments available to me simultaneously so you can play freely amongst them with no overhead in context switching, if you will. With the Linnstrument, I didn't actually realize that was an important part of what I'm doing. But it seems like everything I do now is creating like a mini orchestra, something where multiple instruments are available simultaneously.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, first of all, because you're right. Every demo I've seen of the Linnstrument treats it like a fretboard that's laid on your lap, right? And so taking a different approach is actually pretty savvy, because not everybody wants to approach an instrument like it's an Uber guitar, right?
My ideal device at this instant would be a completely flat surface like the Linnstrument that has no grid at all imposed on it. So it has pressure sensitive, area sensitive, ideally, but completely featureless, because you can always add a grid on top of a flat
Right.
pressure sensitive surface.
Right.
But for various reasons, it's hard to do that. But that would be my ideal. That was what the eye gesture pad, the Fingerworks pad, was pretty close to. But
Yeah,
having
I remember that eye gesture thing. The multi-finger gestures and stuff that they had all implemented. It was amazing. But it's also clear why Apple bought them, because that the patents behind that are just so important for them in the development of the iPad. So,
right.
Well, Tim, I've burned through the time as typical. I really enjoyed talking with you. Before we go, why don't you give us just a minute of your vision for the future? What do you where do you think things are going?
I mean, the spatial 3D stuff, in spite of my development of the space palette, it's still a challenging environment to create things that you don't touch. So, but I love, AR, the new thing that Google showed at I/O this week, like radar-based, so you can tell whether your fingers are rubbing against each other and so on. I mean, there's just a mind-blowing evolution of input devices. So I don't know what will be popular. I mean, the resurgence of hardware, modular hardware, is somewhat surprising. I'm hoping that there's more experimentation in input technologies that use them in creative ways. The input technologies that are continuous, 3D input is interesting to me, not as a replacement for discrete input devices like buttons or keyboards. They're interesting as paintbrush kind of things because they're continuous input. And one-dimensional continuous input is cool, two-dimensional, but two-dimensional lets you draw things, three-dimensional lets you sculpt things. And so, again, I'm not predicting that's where it will be, but that's where it should be. It seems like there's this incredibly fruitful area in sculpting that should be explored. So that's the main thing. Just more expressive inputs, larger iPads.
Well, and I think the Linnstrument is a great pointer. There's something that kind of it draws from sort of classical instrumentation, but especially the expressivity of it is clearly kind of an order of magnitude better than what we're used to seeing. And maybe if that continues, that gives us an interesting area of research.
Right, and the vibrato as a specific example, I could never spend enough time playing a guitar to develop the calluses that would let me play it. But on a Linnstrument, you can get vibrato, effortlessly. So new instruments, eliminate a lot of the hassle and time needed to learn the mechanics of instruments. So there's a lot of progress in that area.
Right. Well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion and a really interesting look at the world of instrument development as well as software development in the musical world. I really appreciate your time and hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Sure.
All right, bye.
Bye.
And there you have it, another interview done. Thanks a lot to Tim for his time and for sharing some of his ideas about instrument creation and software design. I hope you take the opportunity to jump over to YouTube and take a look at some of the things like the Unilooper working on the Linnstrument, which is really pretty impressive, as well as a number of Tim's demonstrations at Burning Man of the Space Pallet. I think you'll find them really interesting and hopefully really inspirational. As always, thank you very much for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends and family. And other than that, I'll see you next week. Thanks.